Hello and welcome to this OECD webinar with me, Duncan Crawford. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, we're talking about knowledge intermediaries in education, organisations that help policymakers and teachers to understand and use educational research. At the moment, many would argue that quality research often fails to have a real-world impact. Coordination issues, gaps in skills, and the sheer complexity of educational research can mean it is a challenge to put it to effective use. So what can knowledge intermediaries do to help this situation? Well, we're going to have a panel discussion in a moment to discuss just that. But first up, we're going to hear from OECD policy analyst Nora Reve, who leads the OECD project to strengthen the impact of educational research. Nora, thank you so much for joining us. A lot of people expect research to benefit society. Doctors incorporate new scientific discoveries in their treatments. For example, engineers design better machines as science advances. Why does it seem to be different when it comes to education, at least sometimes?
Yeah, thank you, Duncan, and a very warm welcome to everyone from me as well. Well, your question is really spot on, right? Education should not really be different. And in fact, advocating for the better use of research evidence in education, policymaking, and practice is not new. Many countries have invested quite heavily in this field in the past decades, and we're working on making education more evidence informed. And yet, some barriers seem to persist. And these include things like education research being sometimes inconclusive or even contradictory. It is still not yet systematically synthesized and made accessible. Policymakers and teachers often feel that they just don't have the time to engage with research and to keep up with new research. And then importantly, there are actually many other factors that influence decision making, right? So it's the political agenda, for example, it's stakeholders' needs and conditions, it's the professional experience and knowledge of teachers and policymakers. So over the past 4 years, the OECD has been working to explore what the different actors perceive as barriers, and importantly, also to map the recent developments in this field and who does what to support the use of research. Um, and I'm very pleased to share that we have just published our third report, Everybody Cares About Using Education Research Sometimes. And my colleagues have posted it in the chat, so you can access it through the link. And in this report, we present new data from close to 300 different organizations on what they do to support knowledge mobilization. And here, let me just stop for 1 second because knowledge mobilization is quite a technical term. We actually understand this very broadly to refer to any kind of intentional effort to support the use of research in policy or practice. Now, in some countries, primarily Anglo-Saxon ones, but not only, there is an independent specific organization that has a mission to synthesize research, to make it accessible, and to support policymakers and teachers in using this research. But actually, it's not just these formal knowledge intermediaries that play a role in bridging the research policy practice gap. There are a lot of other organizations, such as research institutions, teacher education institutions, consulting firms, in many countries, departments within the Ministry of Education, in some countries, inspectorates and teacher unions, and also funding organizations that play this intermediary role. And in our survey, we have actually asked all of these different types of organizations about what they do to support knowledge mobilization. And so before I hand it back, Duncan, I just wanted to share one personal experience with this. So at the OECD, I work on two projects, one that produced this report and another one which is on a completely different topic. It's on AI. And the project leader of that project once asked me, so Nora, could you help us think about our own knowledge mobilization activities? How can we make our own work more relevant for policy, more accessible, and help our target audience, policymakers, to engage with this? And I must admit that my initial reaction was perhaps lacking humility, because I thought like, oh, of course I can do that. I've been working on this topic for years. I know this stuff. And then we began a series of discussions with the team, and it made me realize just how difficult it is to actually apply this slightly abstract conceptual research and turn this into an operational action plan. So this experience just taught me two things. One is that applying research is really not straightforward. This is again a sentence that I wrote down probably 20 times in our reports, but feeling it on my skin was kind of different. And the second thing is that knowledge mobilization is actually quite a complex endeavor. And so I'm very, very glad that we have four panelists here today who will help us interpret our data and just help us understand what this means for the reality of these knowledge intermediaries. So thank you, Duncan. I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much for those opening remarks, Nora. And I think she's set the groundwork there, hasn't she, for the rest of this webinar, where we're going to explore those issues which she's raised and hopefully come up with some answers as well. It's good to see in the chat so many of you have joined us from right around the world. Hi to Lorraine from Ireland, Jonathan from England, Christine in the Philippines, Juan in Spain, Vahant in Rwanda, and so on and so on. Thank you so much for joining us. Please do send in your questions when you have them. You can direct them to specific members of the panel or to all of them. And I will try to get through as many of those questions as I can. Just use the chat function, which so many of you are already using at the bottom of your screens. And away we go. Now, though, it probably is a good time to introduce the panel, seeing as I'm already talking about them. Joining us on the panel today, Anika Wilmers, Senior Researcher at DIPF, the Leibniz Institute for Research and Information in Education in Frankfurt. She's also the Professor at Frankfurt University of Applied Sciences. Alan Chung, Professor and Chair of the Department of Educational Administration and Policy at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Thank you for joining us as well. Isabel Janssens, Operational Director at the Knowledge Centre Leerpunt in Flanders in Belgium. And Samuel Kembu, Global Lead for Learning and Evidence from the Jacobs Foundation in Switzerland, which promotes the application of educational research. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us today. There are loads of questions prepared for you. And like I say, those watching this webinar, please send in your questions for them as well. To kick things off, Alan Chun, from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. If I can start with you. Nora there obviously outlined various issues about research and why it can be so tricky to get people to engage with it. What do you view as the main barriers to policymakers using education research effectively?
Well, thanks, Duncan. I think if you look at, in the past, 2 decades, right? But despite the widespread effort to increase and, improve the use of evidence and research in policy making and practice, there's still, some space to, further develop, knowledge mobilization as a professional discipline in education. I see there's still a disconnect between, the research production and its use in policy practice. For example, researchers, focusing more on advancing knowledge, while policymakers and practitioners need more actionable insights to address real-world challenges. Now, if you look at the recent literature, as we discuss, probably we'll be discussing tonight, the importance of this, different organization, these intermediaries, right? They play a very increasingly important role in bridging this gap. These organizations can serve, as bridges, facilitators and enablers, playing a key role in translating, different ideas, right, research idea into practice, and ensuring effective implementation. I've noticed in the past 2 decades, we've seen a growing number of organizations and initiatives that have tried to address, this problem, such as user-friendly briefs and evidence repositories, right? But I think there's still some challenges that we need to address. Just because of time, I just highlight a couple. Few. First, policy decisions are rarely based solely on evidence. Other factors such as political ideologies, public opinion, economic constraints, and lobbying also play a significant roles. I think research evidence must compete with these, influences, including political narratives and the urgency of decision making. Second, I think as mentioned by Nora, I mean, researchers and policymakers often operate with very different vocabularies, priority and incentives, leading to sometimes miscommunication and or misinterpretation of evidence. As I read the report by the OECD, I think there's a phrase I think is quite important. Is that most evidence repositories are practice-based, while much less evidence is tailored for policy purpose. I think academics and policymakers often operate in a very different timelines. I myself, as academics, I understand that policy makings often moves at a very fast pace, very rapid pace, while research can take years to complete. So as a result, I think evidence must be both timely and direct relevant to policy context to have an impact. I think there's some solution. I just want to highlight a few. I think we need to continue to strengthen the roles of these intermediaries, right? And strengthen the capacity building. For example, we may need to train and certify knowledge brokers, through professional development programs to enhance, the skill in translating research. How about teacher, education training institution? Should they continue to strengthen the research literacy and skills of, the pre-service and in-service teacher? I think second, we also need to foster more collaboration. I think there's some collaboration going on, but I think we still need, further, develop partnership where researchers, policymakers, and educators, co-design studies, ensuring relevancy and applicability. The other thing is the literature also highlights the relational aspect of this intermediaries work, right? We need to build trust between researchers, policymakers, and practitioners. I think this is a very important, success factor. Last, I think these intermediaries also need to ensure that research is context sensitive. Education systems are very, very diverse, right? What works in one setting may not work in another. By tailoring research findings to local needs, I think this, organization, these intermediaries make evidence more applicable across various contexts. That's my take on it.
There's so much you mentioned there, Alan. We could do a whole webinar dedicated to just picking through that answer. Just to highlight one of the things you said there, you talked about the issues of translating the language of research so it's digestible for policymakers. You even said, I think, a phrase along the lines of researchers are speaking a different language some of the time. So never mind the knowledge intermediaries, does research need to be presented in a much simpler format where essentially policymakers, they don't have time to read pages and pages of, hundreds of pages of, complex scientific jargon-filled text. They want something which is understandable and relatable. What should happen?
Well, let me give you one example. At my university, we have been working with, local school sector as well as, education bureau. We have a center called Center for University School Partnership. And in fact, we some of the staff is actually translating, this cutting edge research into user-friendly briefs. And also the other thing is we work closely with the local school sector because these teachers or principals, they may not understand all these jargons, or they may not have time to digest or how in translate this research idea into actual practices. So we have a team of about 40 people that work closely with the local school sector, and that we can translate some of this research theory into actual practices. I think it's quite important because most of the practitioners that the one that I interact with quite a bit, they just don't have the time or the skills or the capacity to do so. I think there's a gap between that. As well as, I think that's quite important to continue to work with, the Education Bureau or the policy making organization in terms of funding, in terms of collaboration, in terms of how we can translate this research idea into actual practices. More often than not, some of our faculty members, they probably, working a lot of good ideas. If, as someone mentioned, right, if those great research just sitting on the desk or in publication, they can translate into actual practices, I don't think it's successful at all. I think the important question is how we can translate this theory into actual practices. But that's the most challenging one. It's very, very difficult to do.
Okay,
But I think we have been making some progress in many parts of the world in the past, 2 decades.
Good to hear. Thank you for that, Alan. Stay with us. We will come back to you later on. I'm going to introduce Annika Wilmers from also joining us on the panel today from DIP, the Leibniz Institute for Research and Information and Education. Alan there outlining all sorts of challenges and issues to why it is such a challenge to get people to engage with research sometimes. What specific strategies do you think intermediaries should use to connect research with policy and practice?
Yes, thank you, Duncan. So coming from an institute that has the mission to contribute to improving education and to finding solutions for challenges in the education sector, I could probably point to the approach that we have that combines different perspectives on the topic, which is the provision of infrastructures for the use of evidence-based or evidence-informed information, transfer activities, as well as research activities that create a knowledge base for knowledge mobilization. So to give you some examples of how this could support educational practice or educational policy, I could, for example, point to the German Education Server, which is the central internet platform for education in Germany, where teachers, but as well as the wider public, can find high quality information and curated information on all topics concerning the German education system and sector, which would be one example of how we could provide research information that can be used in practice and used by practitioners. Or to give you another example would be the more on the research side, several collaborations that we do, for example, in the Research Alliance for Stronger Schools in Germany, where researchers work together with schools in challenging environments to improve specific topics like teaching quality or tackle specific challenges that arise in these regions. And we do these in specific regional centers that were set up so that there's a close communication with schools and researchers. And there's an evaluation going on how to do this. Or we have several projects that have research practice partnerships, for example, and bring together researchers and practitioners to work together on specific topics. But also the field of knowledge creation is quite important in this area, which could be, for example, the conduction of systematic reviews and research synthesis together, actually knowledge that we have on specific questions, but also the whole field of monitoring the education system in order to be able to say something about the status quo and problems that we have or problems that we see, and how we can combine various perspectives in order to find solutions, which, for example, is an activity that we have with the National Report on Education that DIP is coordinating. So to sum this up, maybe I would say that there are like many different ways and perspectives on how you can contribute to create knowledge, and then to make sure that you can transfer it in different ways that are actually helpful.
Interesting to hear. And I am intrigued about the specific challenges which perhaps the German system does face. But there's also a question here from Ivana Jurek, who asks, schools often don't have money to pay intermediaries to bring to bring science-based methods into schools. And she asks, how can intermediaries help schools get funding? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, actually. So it's, I would say if the intermediaries are coming from the outside, they would be funded by research institutions, for example, but could also be specific organizations that have the task to do transfer activities, which are already in between administration, school, and research. So it's not the single school that has to pay for these activities, but rather these activities being implemented into some kind of larger research project, alliance, cooperation, and so on.
Okay.
And
Well,
so schools could, for example, apply to join such programs.
excellent. I'm going to bring in another member of the panel. Please do stay with us. We will come back to you later on. Isabel Janssens, Operational Director at the Knowledge Centre Leerpunt in Flanders in Belgium. Thank you so much for joining us. How does Leerpunt fit into this conversation? What is it trying to achieve? And what are the big issues that you come up against?
Well, thank you, Duncan, for this introduction. We are a small partner in Flanders who try to set up a scientifically based knowledge base about effective didactics, considering the diverse context and learning resources. Next to that, we do that with on a variety of topics based on knowledge needs in education. So we have a sort of agenda that we follow and that is set up with the whole field. Maybe it's interesting to tell you about the structure of our Leerpunt, where we, from the beginning of, we work with two sorts of committees. We have a scientific committee and a user committee. Both have an advisory role. Sometimes they work together. The scientific committee monitors the quality on all the work that we do, and the user committee monitors the usability for the educational field. So from the start, in our own structure, next to our operational staff, of course, we have the users that from the start on are on all the topics that we do. So, for example, we create guidance reports, and that goes through the scientific and the users committee. So we have both voices and from the teachers and the head of schools and so on, but as well, of course, from the academic field. Next to that, we also have valorization products and a story from practice, for example, schools, how they use our information and so on. We create also webinars, for example, or learning snacks at noon when we know that a lot of people from in the field have some time, 20 minutes, as we do at this moment. We do the same from out of Leerpunt. We have conferences, roundtable discussions, poster sessions, summer school for teachers, where we help them and where we communicate about all the evidence from out of our small broker agency.
So what would you say the end result of some of those initiatives are? Have they had any significant impact on the way education is practiced in Flanders?
I think we have a lot of positive voices from out of the practice. They feel like we give them available piecemeals and also quality. We show how qualitative the available knowledge sources are, for example. We use with our colleagues from the EF the same toolkit, but translated on the Flemish field. And we have also other partners, for example, the NRO, Nationaal Regieorgaan of the Netherlands, with whom we do a lot of things together. But there's surely a need for mediation, translation on the scientific knowledge into educational practice. That's for sure. And that's why from the beginning on, we also have a user committee. I think there has to be some sort of knowledge management and shared expertise also. So it's a sort of cooperation in a targeted manner, in fact, to show which research information is available for all the actors. So we are really trying step by step to install a culture of evidence, informed practice towards our schools in Flanders. And it really needs from different angles and perspective, but we really have to hear the voice of the users. And it also includes the students, for example.
When you describe it as, your schools in Flanders, do they sign up to Leerpunt, or how's it work?
Leerpunt is available for everybody in the field of Flanders. We, as I told you, we have webinars, conferences, and so on. So we communicate by different structures to have this mobilization also of what we do. And what we see is that the transparency in which we work, everything is also available for free, so that there are not so many barriers to communicate also with Leerpunt. In our own team, we also have scientists and practitioners who work together and who know the field very well.
Okay, there are some specific questions coming in for you, but I do need to move on. I'll ask you a very quick one though before I do. Rosa Marino Zatoras asks, what metrics determine whether the intervention or action that Leerpunt is making, whether that action has been effective?
We, of course, we do a lot of questionnaires. We have a lot of questionnaires, but on different, because we also release projects for the schools. On different projects, we have a study on the effectiveness of how the research is implemented on the school. So we are looking forward to see what comes out of that study.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Let's bring in Samuel Kembo from the Jacobs Foundation in Switzerland. Thanks for being so patient, Samuel. What's your role in all of this, and why does Jacobs Foundation, why is it involved in, as I understand it, funding knowledge mobilization efforts?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Duncan, and thank you for having me on the panel. It's very good opportunity for me to be here and to share a little bit about that question. I think the report actually starts by providing that rationale for why there is a space for a private fund, and we'll get to that when we look into how these activities are funded. So hopefully we'll get more into the details of why private funding is needed into that. But maybe before getting specifically into your question, I want to highlight the very specific Jacobs Foundation's profile, building on what you have in your report on table 3.1. If readers want to follow me in looking at the report on that page specifically, where you kind of describe the different profiles of knowledge mobilizers. And you have one where that you call, research funders, others partnership builders, and so on and so forth. I think the Jacobs Foundation as a private funder is kind of really a mix of a research funder and a partnership builder. And I'm saying that because, as I will be elaborating a little bit more, we support other organizations whose profile is really, much more into specific activities around capacity building, around, system focus mobilization, or even research focus activities. And I will now be taking the question, but just allow me to state a little bit the legacy of the Jacobs Foundation. So that organization based in Zurich, Switzerland, started in 1989. And initially, Jacobs was mostly supporting premier research. So we funded most of the research seated out there on child learning and development. But one thing that we realized, I think starting in something in the years, 2015 or so, is that you had that disconnect between very high quality research being produced and improvement of children outcomes globally. And we all witnessed the learning crisis, and everyone talks about it. So that's when we had kind of the aha moment, or the tipping point in understanding that we needed to shift and therefore support the ones that are kind of supporting the bringing of evidence into policy. Now to your question, I think there are three streams that came to mind as I was thinking about this on how a funding organization can support knowledge mobilization efforts. So the first one is the very obvious, which is supporting other profiles of organizations that are really into this sector. And I want to be very specific by quoting some examples of the work that we've done in this area from Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Switzerland, and Colombia. In Ghana, we have been supporting a partner there to bring researchers together because the report provides a lot of great examples from across the world. But in low-resource countries, one of the challenges that you would have is the fact that even the research community is not coalesced. So bringing researchers together in order to facilitate their generation of evidence is a key precondition for knowledge mobilization and even knowledge brokers to operate. So that's one of the efforts, really creating that coalition of education researchers in the country. And having a systems change approach that would support the policy sector in that country and have all the education stakeholders working towards a policy-driven research agenda. And almost the same approach was used in Côte d'Ivoire. In Côte d'Ivoire, what was really helpful in that the foundation supported was the fact that the partner was able to really broker at critical times of the education reform journey of the country. And then in Côte d'Ivoire, the same as a private funder, we supported a research fund to ensure that the country or the broker there specifically has resources to commission primary research to support a research and learning agenda. And in Switzerland, we're kind of adapting also the approach to the context. So bottom line or main highlight there is that as a private funder, to your question, we can play really a key role into supporting financially what other brokers are doing. Number two, I think as a private funder or as a funding entity, there is also that role more at the level of creating public goods that can facilitate the work of knowledge intermediaries more globally, especially in the area of synthesis. And that's the point that is discussed in the chapter, in one of the chapters, I think it's chapter 2, because it's, let's be honest, a precondition for policymakers and practitioners to engage with evidence is that there is an accessible evidence base which they can engage with. And increasingly, we have evidence synthesis products that are used to summarize large evidence base, and that will allow stakeholders to access high quality information without having, as you describe in the report, to read hundreds of different papers. And we have examples. I think the previous speaker was talking about the EF toolkit. We have the Smart Bias report and so on. But, and this is a challenge for our sector. Evidence synthesis is very expensive. It's time consuming, and you point to that in the report. So I think as a funding agency, one support that we can bring to the sector is really facilitating an infrastructure that can ensure that knowledge brokers that are also in that work of promoting evidence synthesis can do their work in the best possible way. So that's the second area. And the third and last is really supporting the sector as well with tools, with frameworks that can, again, facilitate the work of intermediaries. And here I'm thinking specifically around how you can bring brokers together to learn from one another. There are other points that were quoted in the report on, okay, are they using evaluations or M&E themselves, and how you build them, almost building a community of practice around knowledge brokers. And lastly, promoting further research, and this is really key for me, on what are the enablers and barriers to research use in education that anyone, therefore, in the sector can benefit from.
Okay, Samuel Kembo from the Jacobs Foundation, thank you for that. If anyone was intrigued beforehand about what the Jacobs Foundation does, I think you've got your answer. We're going to move things on because I've got a very strict timeline I've got to adhere to, and I'd like to ask all the panelists to turn their cameras on because this is a group webinar. It's meant to be group conversation, and we'd like to have the people watching this webinar to see the group taking part in this webinar. So please do turn all your cameras on. We're going to move the discussion forward though and take a look at some of the survey results from the Strengthening the Impact of Education Research project. And I'm glad to say we're also joined alongside our panelists from earlier, also by OECD policy analyst Jose Manuel Torres, who's been an integral part of the project. He's going to present various bits of data, and afterwards the panelists are going to have the opportunity to discuss the findings, but also please do write in your questions and I'll try to get through as many of those as possible. And apologies in advance already, there's so many coming in. I know I haven't got through them yet, but I promise to try to get through some more very soon. Now though, without any further ado, over to you, Jose.
Thank you, Duncan. That's very kind. As Nora mentioned earlier, we surveyed nearly 300 intermediary organizations in 2023 across 34 countries. And we asked them, well, we asked them a lot of things, but in this case, we asked them how intensively they carry out different knowledge mobilization activities. And what you see here is what we call the heat map of knowledge mobilization. That shows the percentage of organizations that engage in each activity, either to a large extent or systematically. Each row represents a different knowledge mobilization activity, and each column represents a different type of organization that we survey. And this allows us to see which type of organization are most associated with which activities. And there is a lot of information here, so I'll try to break it down and just give you a couple of insights. And since we already call this a heat map, we can take a look at which are the hottest activities and which are the coldest activities. And one of the hottest activities here is facilitating connections and collaborations. As for instance, Alan mentioned, many organizations focus on building relationships to promote research use. However, this is not matched with a strong focus on skill development. In fact, some of the coldest activities are training practitioners or policymakers or researchers to use or communicate research, and training intermediaries in brokerage skills. As well, system-level activities like creating infrastructure, processes, or incentives for knowledge mobilizations are also among the coldest activities. But should all these organizations do all of these activities? Making everything hot probably would not be cost efficient. And that raises a second question. Who should be doing what? For instance, research institutes are quite active in generating evidence, as expected, of course, but should they do maybe a bit more in other areas? Would that be efficient as well? We have the case of Teacher Education Institute, and that probably they could be doing a bit more in training. And the last question that I'll leave there in the air, shouldn't public intermediaries be much more engaged in system-level activities, like for instance, coordinating knowledge mobilization in the system? So I'll leave it up to that, and I'll give back the floor to you, Duncan, and our amazing panelists.
Thank you so much. Well, lots of questions posed by Jose there. I don't know really where to start. To make my job easier, I'm just going to hand straight over to Anika Vilmers. Which one of those questions which Jose raised would you most like to answer? There are so many options to get into.
Well, actually, as I'm coming from an institute that is providing infrastructures, I would like to comment on this section of the heat map, because as Jose pointed out, you can see that its activities are decreasing from rather straightforward dissemination way down to the systematic level, where we have much less activities, as we can see. And I think this is absolutely not surprising, as it's very time-consuming and cost-expensive to provide systematic levels and infrastructures to enforce research mobilization. And so I think what we can see here is not that everyone has to engage to the same degree, but rather how important it is to actually share best practice and collaborate, so that some are providing these structures and system level activities that others can join in and just participate, instead of asking everyone to do the same thing. So that would be my point here.
Thank you so much for that, Anika. Alan Chung, what about you? The question actually just came in, which is quite relevant, from Claire Lavery, who says, do we know from that list of activities which are the most effective in mobilizing, now it's just jumped off my screen, the question, unfortunately, because so many questions are coming in, which are the most effective in mobilizing knowledge into effective implementation? I don't know if you know the answer to that or not, but from that list, are there any which are particularly good at leading to effective implementation?
Yeah, I think that, from I think it's the research institution and also for the individual, research institution play a role in that. For example, we see, there's a lot of research, out there. And yet, I think for example, a university, for example, as I mentioned before, right? We have a center called the Center for University School Partnership. I think this is quite important. We have some researcher at the university, and we have some practitioner in the center, and we work together and bring the research into practice. We work closely, as I mentioned, right? We work closely with the local school sector, and helping them, to translate, those cutting edge research into the actual practices. So we work closely with them. I think that's one of the key things that we play a very key role. And also, I mentioned the teacher education training institution also play a role in that too. And we should continue to strengthen, the research literacy and skills of our, pre-service as well as our in-service teacher. We should build into that curriculum.
Okay, thanks for that. Let me bring in Isabel Janssens. There are so many questions coming in, Isabel. Please feel free to comment on the heat map, but just one question here from Viktor Kravchenko from Latvia, who asks, what's the most effective way to transfer research results to teachers for practical use? If you'd like to touch on that as well.
I think it's important not just to hit the educational field with the teachers who are already in the classes, but also to help the training practitioners and to use research and to help the researchers in training to communicate the research with their call on valorization products and so on based on the criteria. We have set up a set of criteria by our both commissions. What I think that's very important is to have a forum and to build bridges. We also have the context with our recurrent products, for example. We are funding valorization products where researchers and institutions can receive a small amount of funding to valorize and disseminate it, their research. And one of the things that we ask is that, of course, the field of practice is involved in it. So to build bridges, you have to bring the two together. That's the most effective way, and not just the linear way. That doesn't work.
Thank you for that, Isabel. Let me bring in Samuel Kembo. I saw you nodding along there actually to Isabel, so I presume you agree with what she was just saying. But to bring it back to that heat map for a second, should everyone do everything in the knowledge mobilization sphere, or should the different roles be broken up somehow?
Duncan, the good thing is I was trained as an economist, and during my training, they always told me to answer "it depends" to all questions. So, but in this case, I don't think it depends. I think the answer is pretty straightforward. In my sense, it would really depend on it would be a matter of what is the journey of the organization itself, right? If you are a knowledge broker trying to secure buy-in, for instance, with government officials, which is something that took, for instance, our partners in a country like Cote d'Ivoire 2 years to secure buy-in. Some of the activities might be, very linear. But if you are much more advanced, known in the system, trusted, have done much of the relational activities to coalesce researchers together, then you can probably enter into the more systemic, which is where you sustain the impact that you can have. So I think it depends on the phase at which the partner, where the partner is in their journey. And then just want to flag, especially if there are funders online, because we have realized and come to realize that these activities take so much time, and therefore people on the funding side need a lot of patience to see this coming to fruition. So just flagging that as I reflect on this.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to reintroduce OECD policy analyst Jose Manuel Torres to move this discussion forward. Before you go on to the next section, Jose, of the information you want to present, there is actually a question which I think is relevant for you to answer because it's an important one. It goes right to the basics. It's from Annie Kidder, who says, what exactly are public intermediaries? Are these NGOs?
We define public intermediaries as units or departments within the public administration that are focused on improving the use of research in either policymaking or school practices. It's one of the organizations that we identify as knowledge intermediaries as a broader concept.
Excellent. There you go, Annie. A description straight from the heart of OECD's style book. Okay, Jose, so moving the conversation forward, I know you want to discuss another area of the research findings. Over to you again.
Yeah, exactly. And the last conversation with Samuel is right on point with what we're going to present now. Because we also asked respondent organizations from the survey to provide a breakdown of their overall funding sources. And when it comes to who is funding knowledge mobilization, a significant proportion of the respondents reported receiving funding from public sources, making it dominant funding stream. But as Samuel probably knows, the nonprofit and the private sectors also play a role, but with a much lower level of funding. Also, around a quarter of respondents reported receive funding from international organizations, and almost a fifth of respondents reported receive funding from others, and this includes membership fees, European funding, European Union funding, or commercial operations. Public sector, of course, is the backbone of knowledge mobilization efforts, which is expected, at least in our survey results, since many of the intermediaries that we surveyed are universities or public research institutes. On average, 68% of the organization's funding comes from public sources, but there is a considerable variation across countries. For instance, 94% of the funding for Dutch intermediaries comes from public sources, but only 28% of the funding for Australian ones does. This reliance on public funding presents both opportunities and challenges. On the one hand, it signals that policymakers prioritize knowledge mobilization rather than leaving it to well-funded organizations alone. But on the other hand, intermediaries must balance their perceived independence while ensuring alignment with policy priorities to secure their ongoing funding. So with this balanced decision, I'll give it back to you, Duncan, and to our panelists.
Thank you for that, Jose. Interesting indeed. Let's bring back in Anika Wilmers. How do you think knowledge mobilization should be funded?
Yeah, actually, I thought it was interesting that as we could see the biggest share of funding is coming from the public sector, which is maybe not a surprise. And there, I was wondering what we could do to create very sustainable levels or measures to put a stronger focus on knowledge mobilization. I'd like to give one example that I can quote here. In Germany, we have the research programs that are funded by the National Ministry of Education and Research, and they fund research projects and collaborations. But they also fund a meta level that is connecting all these different projects. So we have funding on the research directly as well as on a meta level. And this meta level is supposed to support the different research programs and projects in order to disseminate and transfer results and in order to connect with practice and create some sustainability when it comes to research transfer and mobilization. So this could be one example where you can really connect funding with the idea of sustainable knowledge mobilization, which I think is interesting in this regard.
Thank you so much for that. Alan Chung, what's your view on funding? Is there an ideal model?
Well, I'm not sure there's an ideal model, but actually in my part of this area in Asia, at least in Hong Kong, there are two types of funding. Right? One is very research oriented. The other type is more applied, but very rarely you see this, apply, research in, the funding model. And also the other thing though, I noticed that, the current funding model, at least in Hong Kong, often fail to, account for the resources needed to put, research into practice. I mean, it's some of the research, projects are quite, 1 or 2 years, right? You have to, turn in a report, but fairly, they don't take into account that how we can translate that into practice or, give more time to make, impact in the school sector. To me, I think the funding organization doesn't matter if it's private or public. I think it's important they need to consider a more comprehensive funding structure that allow, more time and more resources to put, this theory into practice and vice versa. I think those are my view on that. And also the other point I would like to make is, I think we need to create more incentive for researcher to make an impact. For example, we may consider incorporate knowledge mobilization into academic promotion criteria. Right now, at least at the university, right, most of them are researchers. They're more concerned about publication, they're more impact factor rather than actually, translating this, theory into practice. I think if we can, build into the appraisal or promotion system, I think that will encourage more researchers to be, able to engage in this applied research in the field.
Thank you for that. I'm going to bring Isabel Janssens in. There is actually a question which sort of relates to this from Renata Vigano, who talks about how we've spoken a lot about the importance of making research relevant to policymakers, but Renata says it's important to empower research skills of teachers as professional skills as well. This is a huge problem in my country. Teachers do not have these skills, and it's not easy to persuade policymakers that research skills are fundamental for teachers. So on the funding question, is that something which needs to be considered when you're looking at funding for knowledge mobilization?
Yes, in our Knowledge Mobilization Center, we also have projects for schools where we focus, in fact, on the common language to in between the researchers and the teachers, for example, on what are the research skills that you can use, how can you start in your school with looking at data and so on from the classroom till at school level, and we try to put it in their change management in the schools on the level of the head of the schools, but also on the teacher leaders, for example, as well as the teachers. So I understand why this question is asked, and from our Knowledge Broker Center, we try to have a program where we at the level of the teachers, but also at the level of the guidance services on the schools, we try to help them what are the mechanics on scientific knowledge and everything that has to do with the research questions.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to bring in Samuel Kembo. There's a question from Mara Eroldi, which you might be able to address. She writes, I echo Alan Chung's experience with types of funding available for researchers, which tend to be either academic or practical in focus, and that the incentives of academic researchers are often a challenge to manage. How do you address some of the issues raised by Mara there, Samuel?
Well, I mean, for me, it's not an easy one to think about academic incentives and how you address the inherent issue and facilitate their contribution to knowledge mobilization activities in their different countries. I think Alan has provided one of the ways, which is to say, let's rethink the incentive structure and maybe promote researchers based also on how they support knowledge mobilization activities in their context. When you talk to international researchers, oftentimes working in low-resource countries, they will tell you, well, my support in terms of research cycle, I really stop when I get my data and I publish my paper. The step that comes next in terms of engaging in dissemination and so on is not very rewarding for me. That's almost benevolent. It's almost a benevolent activity. And that's simply because it's not rewarded for my tenure. It's not rewarded for anything that I do next in my career. So there's probably a conversation that we can have locally, but also internationally about how we do that. But if you allow me to maybe say a couple of words on the funding structure. On that, from experience, I have a relatively stable couple of considerations. Number one, I think public funding is essential. And the table that you've shown where public funding was higher is actually quite fascinating. I would love to talk to Jose at some point to see how that varies maybe depending on the income levels of countries, because I'm imagining that in low resource countries it's probably the reverse that is happening, and this is again based on our experience where the international funding, and this is my second point that we provide to some of the partners that we work with, is actually to have a proof of concept so that they can then leverage the public funding afterwards. If you are able to demonstrate your value to decision makers, then they can allocate public funding streams to support knowledge mobilization activities in the countries, because it's clearly inexistent in most of the low resource countries. And I think public funding is important. An example that we all have and we all often quote, and it's even in the report, is the EEF model. They've discovered 70% of ways in which you cannot improve education overall in the country, which is quite an interesting example. But I like to put it in perspective of how much that has cost to the British taxpayer. And lastly, one aspect that we haven't explored yet, but which I think is critical, is the use of private funding in the different countries. I was talking to a group of potential co-funders in a program that we have in an African country. And you could tell that there is an interest, there's an appetite actually for some of them to support knowledge mobilization to the extent that you're able to link it to their sustainability plans within their industry. So there's almost that potential and an untapped potential, I would say, that we could leverage, especially in the resource countries. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. We are approaching the hour mark. Just to let you know, this webinar is going on for longer than normal. There's another half an hour to go. So do please stay with us. I know a few of you are already saying goodbye in the chat because you have to go. Alan, Professor Alan Chung, your earlier answer is elicited a number of questions. And before we move on, I'm going to read one out to you. It's from Diptanshu Mitra, who says, this question is directed to Alan. What do you suggest would be a simple yet effective method of enabling educators to read up and implement up-to-date research findings into their own pedagogy inside the classroom?
I don't think there's a simple yet effective method to do
so.
Based on my experience. Right. Well, we have been working with, a lot of local schools in Hong Kong. For example, we had a project that was quite successful. When you look at the effect size, when you look at the implementation in Canada, we brought in a, very effective, research proven program that help improve, the reading achievement of, students, especially in the primary sector. And yet, when we, bring in all these, elements into Hong Kong, we have to do a lot of adaptation. At least in Hong Kong, teachers are quite busy. They don't have the time to read up this research and actually putting into practice. That's at least my experience. I hope other countries are doing much better than in Hong Kong. So we have to work with them, literally holding their hands, to implement this implementation. But I think what we need is a champion in the school sector. Leadership is quite important, right? To, be proactive in looking, for these effective, strategies, are willing to make that change and willing to mobilize the entire team to work together. To me, a lot of effective instruction, we need to have, the whole village, okay? It takes just the whole village to make the change, I think. So I don't see there's a simple and effective way. As I mentioned before, I think what we are doing in the, we are also a teacher training institute, right? Right now, we're building a lot of, helping this pre-service teacher or in-service teacher, right? Be able to help them to understand the importance of, this research elements, how we can implement that into the practice. I think that's one way we can change it. Once these, teachers graduate, they'll go back to the school. They understand a lot more and understand the importance of, bringing research into the practice. So I think it may take a while.
Thank you for that, and I hope that answered the question. We're going to move things on and bring back Jose, because all good things come in threes. So let's definitely bring back OECD's Jose Manuel Torres one more time, because he's going to present one final chance. Over to you, Jose.
Thank you, Duncan. Yeah, this is the last time that you'll have me bothering you. And I saw some of the questions on the chat, and they asked what were the activities that were the most efficient ones to mobilize research. And before identifying the most effective activities, we have to start evaluating them. So in the survey, we also asked the organizations about the extent to which they evaluate their knowledge mobilization activities. And at a first glance, it might appear that the results are promising. 44% of the respondents reported that they monitor or evaluate their work at least occasionally. But this also means that there is a significant proportion of organizations that still do not engage in systematic monitoring or evaluation of their knowledge mobilization efforts. Again, there is a notable variation across countries, while only 8% of the US organizations reported not monitoring or evaluating their knowledge mobilization activities. This figure rises up to 40% in Germany. As well, we asked those that do assess their knowledge mobilization activities which indicators they use. And I know that there was a question of the audience regarding these metrics. So I'm happy that I can provide an answer to that. The most commonly used indicators focus on reach and access, as they are obviously easier to measure. And I mean by that the number of participants in events or the number of citation of a study. In contrast, there is a minority of the surveyed organizations that use measure to track relationship or competency development, or the changes in their practices related to research use. Unsurprisingly, educational outcomes are frequently cited as impact measures. But maybe this reflects more a lack of conceptual clarity to link knowledge mobilization activities with educational outcomes, and of the definition of these indicators and how they should be used. So for the last time, I'll give back the floor to you, Duncan, and to our amazing panelists.
Thank you so much for that, Jose. And you said you were bothering us, but Amina writes in the chat, thank you for bothering us, Jose. Much appreciated. Maybe you can send her your mobile number later. I don't know. First time for everything. Moving on, let's get some reaction to what Jose was just presenting there. Why don't we turn to Anika Wilmers? What's your view on this? Why is it important to develop the skills and capacity of intermediaries to broker this knowledge? What improvements do you think can be made?
I mean, we do see that there's lots of room for improvement to really get the impact of measures that we take. And I think that's what has been mentioned by my colleagues before. This goes into different directions. One is that it's difficult to measure impact and evaluate it apart from metrics that we collect, but to really have deep analysis of impact is difficult to do. And also what has been said before, it's really time consuming and it's also very expensive to do this. And many research projects, for example, don't consider that they need to do this work at the end, or they should invest more time and money to do this. So this is also a very structural question. How do we organize the things that we do as research institutes or brokerage institutions? How do we organize this so that we actually have the capacity to work on these very important things as well in order to enable future projects to learn from this, for example? So it's both a question of resources as well as of ideas, and we need to share these ideas on how to actually do this kind of evaluation.
Thank you, Anika. Let's get some more reaction, maybe from Isabel Janssens. How do you view the impact of knowledge mobilization activities currently? What improvements do you think are needed?
I can give maybe first some examples. We already talked about Leerpunt, who's funding guidance reports. And what do we do after each publication of these reports? The researchers organize a webinar to disseminate the knowledge and practical implementation for the topic. After 6 months, we organize a second webinar to hear how the schools and educational professionals got started with the guidance report. So we gather several professionals who are trying to incorporate the principles and tips described in the report into their practice, and we will give them a forum to explain how they worked towards a mutual goal using this guidance report. So this is one way to evaluate the knowledge mobilization on an individual level. But moreover, after every webinar or conference we organize, we try to evaluate the knowledge mobilization. So how are the educational professionals going to continue to work with the knowledge they have gained? And how have schools worked with the knowledge in the past? So the latter schools are invited at these conferences and webinars to inspire others with their story. And then we have, by publishing recent, relevant and qualitative Flemish research on our website, we track, for example, how many professionals view the pages and download our materials. And we can also see how many professionals see our communication in the newsletter, of course, social media. So we have an idea of how many educational professionals we are reaching with the research and practice-based hands-on tools. This is, of course, only the start of the knowledge mobilization, but for us, it's a very important first step to introduce the existing research and valorization products. Lastly, I would like to stress again that as a knowledge broker, we try to form a bridge between research and practice, and we are researching effective ways of this knowledge mobilization, and we will disseminate all these results to the different stakeholders in Flanders. So, and the researchers and the professionals engaged in our projects and the support staff in education, the school leaders, so everybody will be informed.
Thank you very much for that, Isabel. I might direct the next question to Professor Alan Chung. It's from Daniela Rocha, who asked, do any of your organizations, well, your organization in this case, support efforts to link research outcomes with educational planning?
Say that one more time, I missed the last part.
Does your organization support efforts to link research outcomes with educational planning?
No, I didn't hear you. Can you, yeah, it was muted. I can hear you.
Can you hear me now? I don't think you can hear me, can you? We'll leave Alan for a moment. Alan, I'm going to move to Samuel instead, because your speakers, you seem to have lost me, unfortunately. So Samuel Kembo, if I can bring it over to you, this question instead from Daniela Rocha. Does your organization support efforts to link research outcomes with educational planning?
Well, I think overall, it links a little bit to what I was flagging in the beginning in my introduction. So specifically in different countries, we really start by ensuring that we understand what is the education sector plan or whatever it is called in that context for the given country. And what we've made sure to support our partners in doing is to design for the context a national research and learning agenda. And I used the word in the beginning in terms of flagging how one of the partners was brokering the relationship with decision makers working on education sector plans and others at very critical moments. So they identify those critical moments when those conversations are happening, and then infusing the research at that specific time. So going to those, to those meetings, bringing the research lens, inviting researchers to disseminate their research, some of the approaches that we've listed there, really being very intentional in what is being aimed to do. So we don't do that as a Jacobs Foundation, but we support the organizations in doing that. And that's therefore the example of what we've seen them doing. With your permission, Duncan, I will just quickly react and close on what Jose shared on the evaluation. I think it's so critical, and it points to me, first of all, to the importance as a funding organization that we come together to make sure that we are also supporting, that stream of work around evaluation monitoring more broadly for knowledge intermediaries and knowledge brokers. And specifically, and this is my second point, I think we should be more disciplined as a sector of education on building the evidence on knowledge mobilization activities. Or as I used to put it, we should build the evidence on evidence use. And it's something that in education is a little bit left behind, but I think it's pretty critical. And actually the numbers are pointing to that and to the importance of doing that. And lastly, the importance of building a community of practice where those, and I like what Isabel was saying on how they do it, how you bring the knowledge intermediaries together. Sorry, I'm struggling with that word because we use a different one. How you bring them together around a community of practice to share tools, to share framework, to share resources, ideas, and so on, so that they can together be much more efficient. But I think the bottom line of what that last chart is pointing to is that as sector of education, we shouldn't use more broadly.
Thank you so much for that, Samuel. I'm going to try and bring in Alan Chung again. Alan, can you hear me?
Yeah. Okay, now. Yeah.
A general question on what Jose was talking about earlier on. Should knowledge intermediaries be evaluating all of their activities or not? What's realistic and most useful?
You mean evaluating those different projects?
Exactly.
Yeah. I think we all understand we always run on a very limited budget and resources in terms of time, staff, funding to conduct, comprehensive evaluation. I think from my experience, I think we need to prioritize key projects or activity for evaluation rather than attempting to evaluate, everything. Now with technology, I think we can use some scalable, cost-effective methods like online surveys or existing organizational data, or analytic tools to reduce this resource burden. But again, as I mentioned, I think we need to prioritize our key research project. I don't think we should evaluate everything. I think the other thing is that something that we are doing is a lot of the research funding does not include this evaluation part. I think we should seek external funding if available and form partnership with other organizations to conduct this evaluation. But again, it's challenging, but I think we should do this evaluation based on the importance of different projects.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, we're running slightly low on time, so I think it's a good moment to have what I'm now going to dub lottery question time. And let's see what I pick out the hat, and I'll throw them open to all of the panel. And if you just, whoever's going to, fastest buzzers to the microphone buzzer, please. Who opens up the microphone first gets the opportunity to answer the question. So please do not be shy. Do not wait for someone else to answer the question. If you want to have a go at it, please raise your hand. You can also use the raise your hand icon at the bottom of the screen to let me know you want to answer the question. So first up, a question from Patricia Grazik from Chicago in the US, who says, I'm a researcher. I'd like to know what advice you have for researchers to connect with intermediaries. Anyone got any thoughts on that one? From our 4 experts in the field, one of them surely is going to raise their hand. They're all smiling. And we have to pick on one of you. Alan's nodding his head, so that's okay. Alan Chung, how would you answer that question from Patricia Grazik in Chicago? She says, I'd like to know what advice you have for researchers to connect with intermediaries.
Well, I think there are many ways. I think most of the researchers, they connect, with, different, intermediaries. But whether we can tap into their, resources, I think is quite important. I think, for example, in my, university, right, we have a lot of researchers working closely with different brokers, right? Be it school sectors and other research institutions. There's a lot of collaboration. I think so. I think we should work as a team at their resources, at least at the university, right? And we bring in different stakeholders when we have this project. I think that's how we can engage other brokers.
Okay, thank you for that, Isabel.
I think that when I'm in the research field together with practitioners, I feel that when they are together in dialogue and both sides stay humble towards each other and try really to listen well and understand each other and build a bridge towards a common language, that will help a lot. Often I was a teacher as well some times ago, but I remember that I was looking at the field of science and research like they are on top of me. But it's also the scientists that have to understand how it works in the classroom, and that it's not always as easy as it seems on paper. So a good listening and stay humble from both sides and a lot of dialogue. I think that's very important on the level of the relation.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question here from Sylvia Hammond from South Africa, open to the panel. Sylvia writes, how do the intermediaries in education differ between the different stages of education, from early childhood education to primary and secondary to tertiary, adult and vocational training? Are there differences if you're working in different sections, different age groups of the education system? Would anyone like to answer that one? Samuel Kembo, perhaps?
That would be my best guess. So I'm not saying that based on experience. I would imagine, just because the ECG, I did some work in that area in the past, it's not the most straightforward sector that you would have in education, meaning it's a sector in which it's harder to convince policymakers on its relevance because outcomes are not tangible when you talk about cognitive development or language or motor skills development of kids. It's harder to make it tangible compared to what we have in education. When you talk about attendance, kids are out of school and so on. Everyone says it. But when you say, okay, children are delayed in their development, it's a little bit hard. So the research in that area might be harder even for intermediaries to bring it to decision makers. So I'm imagining that brokers in that sector might then be facing very typical challenges that might relate to just the nature of the outcome on which they have to work, and therefore their work might be a little bit different. So I'm guessing the type of things around more buy-in and so on would be very likely much more prominent there than for the ones working in primary education, secondary education, or vocational and so on training. So I'm just making that distinction between ECG and the rest based on my guess and then a little bit of experience.
Okay, Anika Wilmers, were you raising your hand there?
I just can to add to that, I'd see a difference depending on whether it's possible to integrate these activities into teacher training, for example, if we have either initial teacher training or further training where we could try to implement measures that we hope that everyone is going to get into contact with. Whereas, for example, in adult education, we would need different ways of how to reach all those trainers and all those intermediaries working in that sector. So that could make a difference, for example, working more with dissemination products and events and inviting for discussions between practice and brokerage and so on. So that could be the type of in which ways you can organize this formally could make a difference in how to reach different education sectors.
Okay, a great question here from Amina Yetlef, who says, could you please provide your perspectives on the AI wave and its potential impact on knowledge brokering? Is artificial intelligence going to make any great waves in the field of knowledge intermediaries? It's revolutionizing, obviously, many other types of work. Samuel Kembo.
Yeah, the main area in the sector where I could see AI being really a game changer is when it comes to facilitating evidence synthesis. I think, you know, AI would just go on and be much more available. And we can imagine a world in which in a couple of years from now, people would be, I don't know, it might actually be the case already, relying even more on AI for policy advice than on intermediaries if we are not careful. So I think we have to, those on the side of, you know, generating research, mobilizing research, have to work on integrating AI tools into their approach. And maybe why not generating an education sector specific AI chatbot, you know, mimicking the ChatGPT, and that research policymakers from the other side might be using. But instead of interrogating a large language model with everything available on the internet, they are interrogating something that is really, really based on research. So that area on synthesizing large amounts of information, that area is you know, availing to us at this stage is, in my opinion, really where we are having a tipping point in education, and we don't have to miss it.
Professor Alan Chung, do you agree?
Yeah, I totally agree. In fact, I'm working with a few of my PhD students. So we do conduct a lot of meta-analysis or research review on effective teaching strategies. So one thing that we're working on is teaching this AI to help us to synthesize these review articles. It saves us a lot of time. It's still in the early stage right now, but what we found is in the past it takes maybe a year or so to complete a very good meta-analysis or research review. Now you can save a lot of time. Let the AI do the groundwork, this dirty work, right? So we can put more energy into synthesizing these results. I think that's one way we can go with this for this evidence-based reform movement.
Okay, thank you so much for that. We are running low on time, so one final question for all of you before we're going to have to pack up our bags and go. If there's one thing you could change in the field to make research have a more positive real-world impact, what change would you make? Anika Wilmers.
Well, that is a good and deep question, actually. What I think, if this relates to what we've actually discussed in with the slides, I would probably stress the point of collaboration, which seems very important in the field in order to actually manage to do knowledge mobilization effectively and sustainable. And I would probably stress that, as many research projects are rather disconnected or not always aligned to some kind of structure that is helping and supporting knowledge brokerage, I would probably stress the point of collaboration in this field.
Thank you for that. Isabel Janssen, what change would you make to knowledge intermediaries to make their impacts have, well, more of a positive real-world impact of the research that they're promoting?
I think the dialogue when the valorization products are set up, for example, so that it are not just products from the scientific side where we think that they could be useful, but just put in the dialogue from the field and ask them, how do you want these valorization products? What do you need? What can help you to bring it just towards the teachers and the classroom to be effective towards the students?
Thank you for that. Samuel Pembo from the Jacobs Foundation, what are your thoughts on this? If there was one thing you could change overnight with a click of the fingers to make knowledge intermediaries be more effective, what would result in a more positive real-world impact?
I think a better understanding of first of all, I have to say I totally agree with what was said and would have said the same. But given that I can add, I think one area that, in my opinion, looks important, even for knowledge intermediaries, is to, and that was the last chart, make sure that we are evidence-driven and evidence-based, even in this area of work. Because I feel we are in the business of promoting research and evidence, but we then forget to be evidence-driven ourselves. And there was a recent paper that came out on linking research generation and cash transfers with adoption of, with the change of outcomes, basically, change in budgets. I have to look again into the details. And what that work was showing is that the timeliness with which you're able to share evidence is what matters. It's not even the rigor of it. It's not the generalizability of the findings and so on. It's really when specifically you bring it to decision making. And that, in my opinion, is critical for knowledge intermediaries to succeed, to understand, to be evidence-driven themselves and in their approach. Yeah, that's the way I would put it.
Very interesting last point to mention there. And last but not least, Professor Alan Chung, your thoughts?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, right, the literature, highlight the importance of the relational and system, aspect of this intermediary work, right? I think one thing I'd like to, change or can improve on is we need to build trust, among researchers, policymakers, and practitioners. I think this is the key success, one of the key success factors. If we can, build this trust among, these different stakeholders, I think we are more likely to succeed.
Okay, thank you very much. That is sadly all we have time for, but I think that was a nice way to end it. Anika Wilmers from DIPF, the Leibniz Institute for Research and Information in Education, Alan Chung from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Isabel Janssen from the Knowledge Centre Leerpunt, and Samuel Kembo from the Jacobs Foundation in Switzerland. Thank you so much for your thoughts and your time. Also, of course, thank you to Jose Manuel Torres and Nora Rivet as well from the OECD. Didn't they do a good job? That's it for now. Thank you to everyone involved, to the production team behind the scenes, and for all of you who sent in your questions. And if you want to learn more about this topic, then please do check out all the links in the chat. There's actually loads of them. And in particular, do check out the report. Everybody cares about using education research in policy and practice. It's a good read. That's it for now, though. Thanks again for joining, and please do join us again for another OECD webinar again soon. All the best.